2023 has already been an incredible year for video games, and with upcoming titles such as Spider-Man 2 and Starfield, this trend is set to continue. But which are we most excited for? Let's put them in a tier list and find out. Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty is technically a DLC, but considering the size and scope of CD Projekt Red's previous expansions, and all of the promised changes set to launch alongside in a free update, I think it's fair to consider it as its own entry.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, especially because it's in a whole new area called Dogtown, I believe, and it brings on new talent such as Idris Elba, which I think is really interesting, but at the same time it seems like it really keeps Johnny Silverhand as one of the main characters, which I think is quite important, especially considering that Keanu Reeves as Johnny Silverhand was one of the driving forces of the game's success. Describing itself as a spy thriller is quite a departure from the original version of the game, but I like that they're going for something different, and hopefully it pays off, because I think it looks really good.
Definitely, and considering all of the new mechanics implemented, such as a cyberpsychosis feature, combined with the intriguing narrative, ultimately push it into ecstatic.
Moving on to Alan Wake 2, we actually haven't played the original, but it does look really good. It looks like it's taking inspiration from other survival horror games that we have played though, such as Resident Evil, which we both really like, but it also introduced mechanics such as playing as two characters and kind of deciding which one you want to play as more, which is an interesting concept, and it makes me quite excited for it.
Even though it looks to be pretty heavily inspired, that novel twist that you mentioned really makes it stick out. The graphics and gameplay also look stellar, and the story sounds promising, so I think it's a pretty safe bet to put it in very excited. The biggest release of the year for PlayStation is undoubtedly Spider-Man 2. Back in May, we saw the gameplay reveal, and it introduced us to the GTA-style switching between the two Spider-Men. And it has been confirmed that you can do this at any time, and while there will be exclusive side quests to each character, for a lot of them, you can choose. And even though we just talked about Alan Wake 2 having the exact same feature, it's still pretty rare to see, and definitely separates it from the previous entries in the franchise.
I also think the introduction of Venom into the game is going to be a massive change. It's hard to see where he comes into the game, with Peter having his own symbiote suit, which despite giving him massively enhanced combat features, it seems like it may cause Peter to become the villain himself, which could definitely be explored in some interesting ways, and for that reason I would put this right at the very top of the list.
Alone in the Dark is yet another game with a star-studded cast, featuring the likes of Jodie Comer and of course David Harbour. And also, due to its nature as a remake, they've got some great source material to fall back on. Whether or not they utilise it to its full potential is yet to be seen, but from the trailer it certainly looks promising.
Yeah, and I think the classic puzzles mixed with the up-to-date modern horror elements could really push it to the top levels, but for now I'd put it in very excited. Assassin's Creed Mirage seems to be the game that's going to take the series back to its roots, moving away from the kind of Ubisoft standard open world in favour of a much more focused story. From gameplay we've seen, the parkour element seems to be really kind of standard but very satisfying at the same time, which I think for the older players of the series will be a pleasant surprise. And overall, it just seems like a step in the right direction for the franchise.
Especially after the more controversial recent entries in the series, I think it's hard not to agree with you. Ubisoft have stated that they won't be completely abandoning their new open world style, but Mirage seems to be a good balance between the two sides. And hopefully, if they can strike that balance correctly, they will manage to please most fans. However, that does seem like a pretty challenging task, and considering we don't know everything about the game yet, I think it's fair to put it in cautiously optimistic. Moving on to one of two remaining Ubisoft titles on the list, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, which seems to be very much the antithesis of Mirage's design philosophy, opting for a gigantic but beautiful open world in the style of something like Far Cry, although I do think it would be unfair to dismiss it as Avatar Far Cry, as from what we've seen of the gameplay, it does look pretty unique. With a combination of modernized combat, as well as using the arsenal of the Na'vi, it definitely sounds like it's got an interesting story to tell, and I'm really hoping it delivers.
With the backing of a franchise as big as Avatar, it does seem like it's going to be hard for Ubisoft to mess this up. However, as I mentioned before with Assassin's Creed, Ubisoft's track record really isn't the best, and for that reason it's hard to see this game becoming a masterpiece. Although I do still keep my high hopes for the game, I'd have to put it in cautiously optimistic. And now for the first of many Xbox exclusives on this list, Obsidian Entertainment's game, Avowed. Although it was originally seen as their take on the Elder Scrolls franchise, in the recent gameplay reveal, it's much more colourful than we expected. Personally, I don't see this as the biggest problem, but for fans of that style of genre, I can see where they're coming from. But other than the art style, the game did look promising, with interesting world building and gameplay mechanics, so I'd definitely be lying if I said that I wasn't intrigued by it.
As a fan of their previous games, most notably Fallout New Vegas and The Outer Worlds, this title has definitely piqued my interest. And to be honest, I much prefer this art style over the one showed off in the CG trailer. Considering the track record of Obsidian Entertainment, I think it's a pretty safe bet to put it in very excited. The reboot of the Mortal Kombat franchise, Mortal Kombat 1, is set to shake up the formula in some pretty significant ways, essentially serving as a timeline reboot for the series, which I think makes it a very good place to jump in for the first time. Other than the story, the gameplay as always looks satisfying, and the introduction of the new cameo system is certainly interesting. Whether or not that improves the gameplay remains to be seen, but from the gameplay we've seen so far, the changes look very significant, so I would definitely put it in very excited.
After watching the trailer, Clockwork Revolution really stood out to me as a game inspired by the steampunk Bioshock aesthetic, while implementing its own main feature which essentially allowed you to travel through time, influencing events in the past but also the future. Although throughout the course of the game the changes to the environment seem to be minor, it definitely appears that the changes to the story could be of much larger scale. However, I do understand that that's quite hard to convey through a trailer, so for that reason I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt because I really like the look of it and I'm going to put it in very excited.
So far, we've only seen very short clips of the gameplay of Fable, but from the story trailer we got at the Xbox showcase, it certainly looks intriguing, maintaining that British style of comedy from the original games and modernizing the visuals for a new audience. And although very little of it was actual gameplay, all of it was recorded on an Xbox console, and I really enjoyed the self-contained story within the trailer. However, because of its lack of gameplay, the highest we can put it in is cautiously optimistic.
Lies of P seems to be a much more action-heavy take on the Souls-like genre, which personally for me is a very good thing. It also takes a much more futuristic approach, whether it be with its enemies or with its environments, which by the way look incredible. I also love how they took a classic story and kept it familiar, but at the same time made it so unique. And I'm excited to see how the story plays out when it launches, so I definitely put it in very excited.
Payday 3 is the long-awaited sequel to Payday 2, seemingly making incremental changes to the formula and taking players to the entirely new setting of New York.
However, there's one concern that I have with this game, and it's that the gameplay didn't look that much different. Obviously, there was a few improvements to the assault part of the game, but personally, I really love the stealth aspect in Payday 2, and I felt this really wasn't shown off in the trailer that we saw. Alongside the trailer, we also got a preview from IGN, in which they raised some issues regarding the difficulty of the stealth, which is especially concerning considering how unforgiving it was in Payday 2. And because of that, as excited as I am for the game, I'm gonna have to put it in cautiously optimistic. RoboCop Rogue City is a very unique take on the first-person shooter genre. You play as a character with tank-style movement, which makes you feel indestructible, but also very slow at the same time. I think it definitely hints at some unique and exciting gameplay. However, at the same time, I think it could be quite hard to pull off, and I can definitely see it not hitting for a lot of people. So for that reason only, I'm going to put it in cautiously optimistic.
Stalker 2 is nearly here, placing you in the terrifying and deadly world of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, a post-apocalyptic setting that will undoubtedly introduce you to some very horrifying foes. And for fans of the franchise, that seems to be exactly what they want. It's definitely a highly anticipated sequel, and it seems like the developers have taken the very necessary time to polish the game into its very best version. I think there's very little here that could possibly go wrong, and for that reason, I'll have to put it in very excited.
Star Wars Outlaws takes a much different spin to the other high-profile Star Wars games we've seen. In this, rather than being a Jedi like most other games, as the name says, you take control of an outlaw. This allows for a very different story to be told, especially considering the game is fully open world. The gameplay looked okay, having you team up with your alien companion, but the thing that really impressed me were the action set pieces, in particular the bike riding scene from the footage that we saw. However, for the third time this video, I do have to mention that it is made by Ubisoft, and for that reason we really can't be sure what it's going to be like when it comes out, so we feel it's only fair to limit it to cautiously optimistic. Immortals of Aveum is a game that quite simply doesn't look that interesting to us. The gameplay looks quite generic, and the premise of the story just didn't seem very intriguing. From what we saw, the combat looked fine, but it really wasn't anything too special. And although the environments did look good, they just seemed a bit uninspired, and overall nothing was really able to pique my interest. Therefore, although I really do hope that it proves me wrong, from what I can tell right now, I really am doubtful.
And finally, arguably the biggest title on this list by almost all definitions, Starfield. There was some doubt in my mind as to whether or not Bethesda would be able to pull it off, but after seeing the most recent showcase, all of my doubts have disappeared. Being Bethesda's first new franchise in over 25 years, they've got the potential to start something really special. What I like most about what we've seen is the freedom it gives you to explore the world, or rather worlds. That's right, Starfield features over 1,000 different planets, and while some of these will feature very little, others will house entire cities, each with plenty of side quests and unique discoveries. The potential for this game is truly limitless, and it ultimately comes down to just how much they can realize. But so far, it's looking to be a lot of it.
Yeah, I think you summed it up very well in that the game really does have the most potential to be something incredible. And as time goes on, it seems like that outcome is getting more and more likely. So although it definitely is a possibility that it's not as good as it seems right now, I really can't help but feel ecstatic.